Right, well, good afternoon everyone, and thank you for joining this webinar, Expanding Circles, where we're going to be exploring restoring local equity in the built environment. And today's webinar is hosted by Biohm. I'm Harry Darkley, the Director of Operations at Biohm, and I'll be chairing today's event. This webinar is part of a series run by the Circular London and the London Waste and Recycling Board called Circular Economy Week. So before we begin, I'd like to extend our thanks to them for organising this talk. Now, perhaps more than ever, it is clear that business as usual is no longer an option if we want to move towards an economy that works not only for individuals, but for the environment. That we have for some months now been isolating ourselves from one another because of the global pandemic, it has given many the time to reflect on the world that we've built for ourselves and the real costs it has for people and the environment. Many have called for a real change. They see an opportunity to tackle the problems in our economies that have caused so much damage and iniquity. Challenges which up until now have seemed vast and insurmountable. Now, perhaps more than ever, the public mood is changing. This webinar brings together some expert voices who continue to challenge the status quo. They are champions for a more equitable economy. Ken Webster from the University of Exeter, Jessica Prendergrass from the Onion Collective, and Ehab Syed, our founder at Biohm. Following the presentations, we will have a Q&A session. So at this point, I would encourage everyone to pose their questions to the panelists through the Q&A button you'll find on your screen. The chat function is also available for attendees if you want to share any links or continue the conversation. Now, our keynote speaker is Ken Webster. Ken's considered by many to be the leading thinker in the circular economy. He's a senior lecturer in circular economy at Exeter University, and author of Circular Economy, A Wealth of Flows, as well as Sense and Sustainability, Educating for a Changing World. Ken is also instrumental in the success of the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, where he was head of innovation, and is today bringing together circular thinkers from around the globe for the inaugural conference of the International Society for the Circular Economy being held this July. So I'd like to welcome Ken to the webinar.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Harry. Can you hear me, Harry? Does it work?
Certainly can, yes.
Okay. That's a lovely introduction, so that saves me running through bits of the biography. But I was delighted to be invited to this webinar for a couple of reasons, because you provided just a small window to say something, which is always a good discipline to try and get to the point of what you might be trying to get over in a very short period of time. So that was excellent. The fuller description of what I'm about to say is on my LinkedIn page. People are very welcome to pick it up there. And I just want to go through some of the four big contexts I'd like to bring to the attention of the participants in relation to circular economy in a changing world, which have got direct relevance to the built environment. Now, you've got lots of expertise on the panel around the built environment and materials, so I'm going to do much more an economics approach. So with no further ado, I'm going to share my screen, and that's just to get me into the prompt, so fine. There we are. I hope that's pinned there. Thanks to Harry for mentioning we have the inaugural conference of the International Society for Circular Economy. You can join for free or as a full member. Full members tend to be those who want to get the advantages of producing papers, sharing information and papers at a quite detailed level. But it's very much open this next conference, because we've got a number of keynote speakers, some interesting content, and it's on the 6th and 7th of July, and if you check out the website you can see some basic details. Anyway, There's only one picture in my slide sets today, and this is a diagram I put together. And what I want to do is refer you to the fact that this is not just going from a degenerative economy to a one which is regenerative. It's not only about materials, but I'm going to suggest that what's come to the fore more and more is the question of the monetary stocks and flows. I want to say two qualifiers when I talk about the economy. And the first one is that the economy was in deep trouble before COVID-19. And a phrase I stole from somewhere is this one below. It's not a case of look what the virus did. It's more about look what the virus revealed. It exposed an economic system which many of us knew was in some trouble anyway. So it wasn't caused by COVID as more exposed by COVID. The second qualifier to my few comments this afternoon are that the economy is not just one thing. And I think more and more writers are beginning to revive the very historical preference for describing a productive or industrial economy as counterpoint to a financial economy. And of course, for many decades, the latter has been dominant, so that business has been paying attention to the more financialized elements. Now, the circular economy, in this sort of commentary, I want to say is really, really simple. It's about shifting from an extractive to a circulatory emphasis. It's not rocket science. But what most people miss is a monetary question. So, okay, we all know about the take, make, and dispose materials and energy sort of economy, although noting that energy you can't turn that in a cycle, it's always a throughput. But there is also this idea of a linear extractive monetary economy, where you create credit out of nothing, give it a spin, put it into assets, and feed the whole process again at the bottom. So it's to service, and the cost of it is servicing an expanding private debt bubble. Adair Turner, interestingly, the former head of the financial authority, the FCA, said that above a certain level, debt is like financial pollution. Right, and so what? Well, the response to the last crisis, since we're in one now, was to maintain asset values. And so the emphasis in the economy is save the financial system first, and which is, if you like, a little bit, it's fairly predictable, but it shows where the emphasis goes in people's minds. But the virus did show up a couple of things that we could use in our sort of deliberations. We pretty much realize the economy is woven on a brittle supply chain. It's not resilient. And why does that matter? Well, systems theory tells us that an effective system, all systems which are all living systems, all related to living systems, they're an interplay between efficiency, the big channels and the structure, and resilience, which is more the exchange function. It's at the periphery, it's all of the small things. And interestingly, the science says it's not nice to have some resilience, but it's necessary. And so anything that doesn't have an appropriate interplay between efficiency and resilience is very far from an effective system. It's a brittle one, we discovered that. Now, what do we get from resilience? What do we get from this exchange or network approach? We added value with what we have around. We can cascade materials like nutrients. We can circulate income more locally. Peer-to-peer infrastructure in the commons can be vibrant centers for wealth creation. And if that's part of a necessary shift, not only because we've seen what happens if it isn't there, but if it's actually necessary because all effective systems have this interplay, it's just a question of when and how we get on with it. Now, how to get on with it? The virus destroyed a central myth. There never has been any shortage of money for this. I note in the longer document that on the 15th of April, the USA invented $6 trillion. Now, nobody can get a real handle on trillion, but somebody said to me, if you were there at the time of Jesus and you were given £1,000 every day, you still wouldn't have had £1 trillion. So this is some incredible number. And according to what they call modern monetary theory or post-Keynesianism, the limits are in the real economy. Does the economy respond to the input? And it's not the budget. The budget isn't the limits. And of course, I jokingly put along the bottom that other economic ideas are available. Please see your supplier for details, because this is a question of ideology in the end. It's a question of theory, but we've just had a demonstration that there is no shortage of money should we decide to put it into something we want. And a takeaway thought I thought would be to quote John Kay, an economist. I know you can read, but I think it's interesting to say, start from the second line, prosperity and growth, whatever growth means, of course, require that entrepreneurial energy should be focused on the creation of wealth rather than the appropriation of other people's wealth. Decentralization of authority and deconcentration of activity limit rent seeking. That's that surplus, that unearned surplus that can be got by creating scarcity and controlling access to resources. And I think that's what we really need. We need to be having a multi-level economy in which resilience is a built-in feature, in which there is infrastructure built to enable this. And there's a very strong logic to it. If you take the American expression, what's not to like, that's how I feel when I realize that this is before us if we want to pick it up. So there's just my introductory points, and I'd hand back to Harry.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Ken. There's certainly a lot to think about in your talk, and I think the idea that we have a degenerative economy and need to move towards one that is regenerative is really at the core of the conversation now. And just that realization that sort of rent-seeking, extractive activity that has really become the foundation of our modern economy, certainly in this country, has really been shown for what it is, and that it doesn't necessarily bring the value that we need to the world that we're living in now. Well, thank you. I'm sure there'll be lots of questions on that. I certainly have some of my own for later. Now I'd like to introduce Jess Prendergast, who is one of the founding directors of the Onion Collective, a social enterprise based in Watchet, West Somerset, where they focus on community business and bringing economic and social equity not only to the community of Watchet, but to the Southwest. Jess's work with the Onion Collective has exposed the vulnerabilities of our wider economy that are a direct result of not investing enough in local communities and not allowing that value to circulate where it's created. Jess has established a number of social and community enterprises and is a board member of Power to Change, a charitable foundation that focuses on strengthening and empowering community businesses across England. So with that, I would love it if Jess could join us and share her thoughts with us.
Thanks, Harry. I echo your sentiments about Ken's introductory remarks, so thank you for that also. I'll try and respond to some of what Ken said in parts where I feel able, but mostly what I would like to do is explore our project with Biohm in Somerset and try to add some kind of tangible texture, I guess, to what these kinds of new futures that people are talking about might look like on the ground. So as Harry says, I'm a director at Onion Collective, a social enterprise. We're place-based and we're community-centric. We began life primarily focused on how to bring community voices into economic regeneration. But over about 8 years now, our work has evolved and become much more about systems change. Our lens very much remains a local and a grounded one, but the ambition is to demonstrate what is possible if the system is reimagined, and if the economy that we choose responds to social and environmental and cultural justice rather than just efficiency and profit and wealth. So this really matters here in this place where I live. Watchet, where we're based, has the lowest wages in the UK, has the lowest SME productivity in the country, and most worryingly, has the lowest social mobility in the country. So that means that young disadvantaged people growing up here have the least chance of changing their futures of people living anywhere else in the whole country. And kind of by way of illustration, only about 26% of our school leavers go to university here, compared to 46% nationally. So it's a real tangible impact on people's lives. And in some quite significant parts, all of that reflects the structure of the local economy. So Watchet it's small, it's beautiful. It's also a slightly grubby kind of coastal town with an industrial heritage, but surrounded now by kind of perfect Exmoor villages, predominantly full of second homes. The town's defining industry for the past 250 years was papermaking. So initially in kind of handmade mills, but over a quarter of a millennia, developing into a substantial heavy industry paper mill. We made, it's not much of a claim to fame, but we made about 90% of the loo roll holders in the country until quite recently. So in a weird way, in this sense, we've also had a kind of circular, a role in a kind of circular conception for hundreds of years. So taking waste resources, initially rags and later scrap cardboard and waste cardboard, and making new products from that waste stream. In 2015, however, by now owned by a FTSE 100 company, the mill became the victim to the global market, in which an isolated plant in Somerset, far too far away from the motorway, could no longer efficiently compete. And the mill was closed with very little notice, actually on Christmas Eve 2015. And the impact of that closure of the industry was huge. About 20% of our town's workforce lost their jobs overnight. But much more than that, the town lost its defining purpose, I guess. At the time of that closure, we at Onion launched a major cultural project to explore and to celebrate the industrial history of the mill, but it quickly became really clear that this wasn't about, this was about social narratives rather than industrial ones. And not one person that we spoke to when we talked about what had been lost with the closure of the mill said that it was about wages. The purpose of the mill was jobs, of course, but also skills and development and purpose and agency. And the men working there, mainly men it was, didn't see their jobs and their role as a means to an end, but being about the value that it gave to their lives. In lots of ways, this is in no way surprising. And I'm going to guess that pretty much no one attending this seminar works for money alone, despite what the kind of prevailing neoliberal narrative would tell you. It's a model that simply doesn't reflect who we are and what makes us human. And if you think about yourselves as social entrepreneurs or as researchers or innovators, or you think about creative people and artists and makers, and anyone who runs a small family business servicing a local population, or everyone who opted for public service as employment, so doctors and nurses and people in the charity sector and local government officers even, none of these people chose that direction because of wealth or profit. They chose it because of purpose and meaning and social and common values. And for much of its existence, the paper mill as a business also cared about those values. So it wasn't about industry, but it was also about building a community. And the owners of the mill for hundreds of years made a really strong connection between their economic role and a wider societal one, creating lots of the infrastructure in the built environment of our town, building housing and the library and the public hall and the chapel and much more within the town. And it seems to me that this this connection between society and economy is this loss that we've seen most clearly in the post-war period. So the economy is split, as Ken talked about, between this kind of productive economy and the financial one. And as the state has stepped in to social functions, it's also enabled the private sector to retreat into a different sphere. And we've lost much of this interconnection of responsibility between economy and society. Most obviously since the 2008 crash, we've seen this ever wider gap between what the market cares about and what the state can afford to provide. And for me, that's where the shift is really needed, where the social economy needs to play a defining role moving forward. So we can be, I think, pleased by the progress viewed through a circular lens in terms of industrial evolution, absolutely. But there's a question of what about social justice that remains really strong. And a system which is adapted so that it doesn't extract value from the planet is only so much of an improvement if it still extracts value from people, and if efficiency still cuts down jobs and decimates communities. What the paper mill did for this town was also much wider than the contribution to the built environment and the built physical infrastructure. So it was about what these buildings made possible. It was about something much deeper, contributing support and identity. And locally, the mill was known as the family, not in some kind of mafia way, but in the sense of it enveloping the community and being a real protection. And it cultivated and it animated the social or the kind of community infrastructure which has kept people safe. The importance of these ties, these kind of ties that bind us together, has never been more clearly shown than in a pandemic. I really loved Ken's use of the term brittle and brittleness to describe the kind of failings of the economic system, and referencing how readily it's broken down under pressure and that kind of intent. But what brittle also really conveys to me, I guess, is this sense of kind of unfriendliness and a lack of warmth and something not resilient or adaptable. Whereas what we've seen on the ground is that faced with existential threats, our community is powerful and adaptive and kind and enveloping. And in the absence of the normal economy, inverted commas, with everything non-essential closed, we've seen really clearly the value of our social infrastructure. And I include in that description all kinds of organisations within the social economy, which turns out to be much wider than people previously recognised. So from community organisations, but to local greengrocers and butchers and retailers, it's this kind of social economy which cares about so much more than profit and wealth that's really held us up. In Watchet, this interconnected social ecology built on trust and shared value and common purpose, built on knowing each other and caring about each other and protecting the vulnerable, has been proven itself to be able to react, protect, connect people far faster, far more efficiently, much more effectively than either the centralised state or the disconnected market. And I guess that's my challenge, if there is any, to the circular economy narrative, and I think this is something that came through quite clearly in what Ken was saying, is it must be regenerative for communities too. So people are viscerally affected by the economic system that we live within and the modes of employment and the values that it conveys, but they have almost no say in its development and its trajectory and its purpose. And for me, this is what makes the model in Watchet that we're developing with Biome really groundbreaking and exciting. And I'm not going to attempt to explain what eHub will explain about what Biome are doing properly, but together we're building the world's first community-centred biomanufacturing plant, using mycelium to turn local waste into new products to sell to the local market, just as we once turned rags here into paper. But what's especially powerful is how this model embraces a circular approach to community. So it attempts to put the people most affected at the heart of industrial innovation and to ensure that their needs are centre stage. These people at the end of the day are the workforce and the families on which this new future will be built. And that relationship cannot be exploitative or extractive of them as individuals or as a community. So our shared approach in Watchet is pre-distributive, seeks to care about the quality of work, about opportunities for growth for employees, We're looking at what's needed to ensure inclusivity in the workforce, whether that's childcare provision on site to suit young mums or knowledge transfer from those who are nearing the end of their working life. And it's about educational engagement from the start, so that children in our schools know and understand this whole story, and they can see what work can mean, how industry can care about the planet and well-being, and perhaps most importantly of all, can understand that we, each and every one of us actually, can make change, can have agency, can reimagine, and be part of bringing about a much better future. This also means finding a way to get ownership into community hands, away from this kind of real estate bubble, asset bubble that Ken also talked about, because property ownership in the prevailing economic system crosses this distinction between the industrial and the productive economy and the financial one. So it's become far too often valued not in terms of its service or the use it can be put to, but as an asset class with investment driven only by the prospect of future financial gains. And this has huge implications for the way the market works, for what's affordable and what's possible. And ownership is too often by those who care not about productive use at all. So to tackle this kind of systemic problem, what we're trying to do here is to protect and reintegrate industry and economy by means of community ownership and stewardship of our assets. The profits from the facility will be split 50-50 between Biome and the community, with our part reinvested in the kinds of things that have been stripped away by the state and that the market isn't providing here, but that support and enrich our lives. So from youth clubs to culture, to public space, to housing for local people. And I think as Ken talked about and intimated, this is about reprioritizing the productive economy, creating more resilient, more effective economic systems, with an emphasis, of course, on low carbon, on circular, regenerative initiatives. But those initiatives, for us, need to be just as much about regenerative communities as the first line of defense of the vulnerable, and as an absolutely vital building block in any kind of new social economy that we're all working so hard to ensure emerges. Thank you, Harry.
Wonderful, thank you very much, Jess. There's a lot in what you just said, but I think it really touched on what this event is all about, which is expanding those ideas that we find in the circular economy, but might only really translate to the flow of resources, and bringing that to how we really value those social resources, that social flow within communities, and don't just extract people, in a very physical way as well, people away from communities once they have a good education and can serve their economy elsewhere, but really sort of embedding that value and keeping it, where it was generated for the benefit of everyone. And you touched on the work we're doing together in Watchet, so I would encourage everybody to search that out on the internet afterwards if you're more interested. And on that note, the next person I'm going to introduce is Ehab Syed, who's our founder here at Biome. He is also the Director of Innovation, is conducting PhD research at Northumbria, and is an engineer, a circular economy strategist, designer, and real innovator in the built environment, with a passion for bringing nature-inspired design into everything we do at Biome. So Ehab, please join us here.
Thank you very much for that, Harry. I must say both of those talks were absolutely fascinating, and I think would provide a really good sort of starting point for what I'm going to be talking about. I'm just going to share my screen. Right, hopefully you can all see my screen now. Right. So my talk will be about how we can use nature's genius to inspire us to revolutionize the industry and also restore local equity in the built environment. And first I want to talk a little bit about biomimetics, as it drives absolutely everything that we do here at Biome. Biomimetics or biomimicry is not the simple imitation of natural form, but it's rather the abstraction and extraction of principles and biological processes and systems, and then applying that learning to the technologies and the approaches and systems that we embed in our products, in our systems, and in our economies as a whole. And we're looking to revolutionize the built environment and the way we do business. And we're doing that through our bio-based materials, our construction systems, and a range of services and research that we offer. Starting with our bio-based materials, I'll do a quick introduction of what we do first. Orb, or organic refuse biocompound, is a sheet material made out of food or agricultural waste, mixed with an organic natural binder that we have developed. The binder is so natural that it's actually edible before it's mixed in to create the material, and there aren't any chemicals or additives, and you can see it can be machined and CNC'd, and it really brings in a completely new meaning to bio-based materials, allowing them to actually compete and outcompete current synthetic alternatives. Orb is also being developed into a plant-based concrete over the next 2 years, which is a super exciting journey we're going on. Another material we work with is Mycelium, which is the vegetative root structure of mushrooms. It's usually underground in forests, and it's known as nature's internet, connecting plants and tree life, allowing them to exchange nutrients and resources. And there's a lot we can learn from the mycelial networks and how we can set up our economy. Our mycelium is currently being applied to insulation for buildings. We've managed to outperform almost everything on the market when it comes to thermal conductivity and health and well-being. And we are really trying to evolve our strains to drive the innovation. So Jess was talking earlier about improving efficiencies. We're not doing that by cutting jobs or reducing costs in the traditional way, but rather by improving the technology and evolving our strains to teach them to consume different waste streams and byproducts, as well as also teach them to perform better during the growth or during the manufacturing process. Whilst we're evolving our strains, we found that one of our strains can consume plastic, and together with the Onion Collective, we were granted the Plan Plastic Prize last year. And you can see here some microscopic images of the mycelium slowly consuming the plastic. We're consuming things like PU and PE, which are found in almost everything around us, and that will allow us to then commercialize this technology and use it as a true waste management approach to the plastic problem that we're facing. Together with the Onion Collective, as Jess has mentioned, we're going to be delivering our mycelium insulation at the scale of the construction industry in Watchet, West Somerset. We took one of the old disused buildings from the paper mill that closed down and started turning it into our very own manufacturing facility. So again, just thinking about how we can be as regenerative as possible and use the infrastructure and the local value that is already there to promote and develop this new business and this new way of working. Our materials will eventually be combined to form our revolutionary construction system, Triagamy. Triagamy is inspired by the molecular structure of carbon, which means that your building can shrink and grow in accordance to your needs. You don't actually need to do major foundation work to change your building's infrastructure, which also introduces a completely new and agile way to the way that we set up our cities and our built environments. It reduces the environmental impact of buildings by up to 120%, build times by 95%, and costs by 70%. We're looking at around 2 years before this is implemented at a large scale, and throughout that time, we're looking to implement it in pilot projects and small-scale projects. But what I really want to talk about today is the business models and approaches that we have developed to deliver these technologies in the most equitable and regenerative way possible. This is our business model at the moment, and it focuses on looking at how we can connect stakeholders, take into account every impact that can be resulting from our processes on all the stakeholders around us, and looking at how we can align their incentives. And when you start taking such a biomimetic or nature-inspired approach, it becomes far too complex for our human brain to comprehend and do justice, really. So by the use of artificial intelligence and intelligent approaches that are currently being developed in computer science, we're able to map the economy in a much more detailed way, I guess, or a much more accurate way. We can see all the interwoven links in between the financial sector, academia, the healthcare sector, and the construction industry as well. because the construction industry is not operating on its own, and it touches on all of these different areas. And we have to consider that when we're looking at the technologies we're bringing to market and how they can impact all of those other areas of our economy. Here is the diagram that we all must be very familiar with now from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, showing how we can achieve a circular economy by separating technical materials on the right side of the screen and biological materials on the left side, and keep them in circulation in separate cycles. But what we at Biome would really like to do is expand that biological material cycle, which is now on the right side of the screen, and prove that biological materials can actually outperform technical materials. We're already proving that with the tests that we're doing against standards, and we're showing that there's real legs for bio-based materials to actually take over what currently is being achieved by synthetic materials. And this diagram over here can show that when you are constantly going through circulation, there will inevitably be some outputs that are landfilled because of the way our economies are currently set up, and mainly because of the way that we design and create our materials, how we mix natural materials with synthetics, and the composites that are created within synthetic materials will eventually have to end up being incinerated or landfilled. The difference is when you're working with bio-based materials, during incineration, which is probably the last thing you want to do, and as well as landfill, the emissions and the impact that it has on the soil is much less damaging than it would be with synthetic materials. Hence, that is why we would like to expand that biological technical material cycle and focus on really developing that further. And this all sits within the industrial economy, which also sits within the financial economy and the wider economy. And what we want to do and what we want to talk about here with this webinar, and the reason we called it Expanding the Circles, is to expand the circles of the circular economy beyond material flows, just like Ken and Jess just mentioned, and really take into account how we can implement circular principles and regenerative principles in the wider economy. Currently, the way the financial economy works is quite linear. You have wealth moving from being created from one place and then moved to another and concentrated in one particular place with a very small population of the world. And some of that wealth trickles down in other places, but it's mainly a linear approach where the few at the top tend to gather and concentrate that wealth. And here's a little representation of what that visually may look like. You have those at the bottom that are potentially adding a lot of value, arguably more value than those at the top, are actually not being able to reap the rewards as much as those at the top are, and the ones at the top are getting all of the glory. And what that creates is a lot of pockets within the world where the wealth is concentrated. When we bring in the question of equity, it really makes things much more complicated, because we're not talking about equality, we're talking about being fair and equitable and ensuring that where value is created, not just financial value, but also cultural, social, and environmental value, that is also being rewarded equitably. And if we look at the wealth distribution around the world, and I'm assuming that this is based on GDP per capita, which is also a massively misleading calculation, you can see that the UK, for example, is amongst the top ranking economies in the world. However, you still have pockets like Watchet, where, over here it says that the average wealth per adult is between 50 to 100,000 pounds. In Watchet, the average income per household, not per adult, is 16,000 pounds. And that is perceived on the global scale as in being part of one of the most wealthy economies. So I think when you talk about equity, it's really important that we take into account that we're not all starting on a level playing field. The capitalist economies that have been governing our economies for quite a while, and our approaches in business for quite a while now, have created a lot of inequalities around the globe. And if we're going to be instilling equity, we need to take into account these inequalities and make sure that the distribution of wealth is carried out in a very sensitive and considerate way. So the idea really is to transform that finance flow into one that is much more circular and regenerative, and one that appreciates other values beyond just financial or economic value, but also takes into account social, environmental, and cultural values. And that it can only really be done in a very justified and clear and honest way if you take a much more biomimetic approach. Because, like I said earlier, using GDP per capita to measure the wealth distribution around the globe is not a fair representation, and we need to take much more intelligent approaches when we're running these analyses. We've been awarded and recognized by a number of international and national bodies around the world. And we're about to launch our crowdfunding campaign, so we would love for all of you to come along with us on that journey. And I just want to close by saying that, you know, it is very easy to think that the way the economy has been set up and the way that it has been running for so long is almost impossible to change. But the pandemic has really showed us that we can very easily pause and change our operations and our approaches when we're forced to. And at Biome, we're not looking to demonize or to exclude any of the large and major players that are currently in control of a lot of our economies. We want to work alongside them and show them that there's another way to still be profitable, to still be able to achieve the goals and development goals that you are looking for, whilst making sure that there's an equitable distribution of that wealth that is being generated. Thank you very much.
Wonderful, thank you, Ihab. Really great to hear, although I'm deeply involved with it, of course, all your thinking around how we sort of implement these principles in our economy going forward, and what's actually being done today by local communities and similar companies to bring these principles into our working lives in a very real and practical way. We've got a few questions. Again, after those three individual, very interesting and thought-provoking talks, I would encourage everyone to pop their questions into the Q&A, and we'll try and get through as many as possible. One of the ones that sort of came up earlier, and I think this touches on probably all three of you, but I think I'd like to hear from Jess first. The questioner really pointed out that a vast majority of the wealth in the world is concentrated in a very small area. You know, asset management funds or a few incredibly wealthy individuals. So sort of in that context, the question is sort of how do we achieve democracy when the way we do business is so far removed from how we run the economy in a circular way? And how do we get more democracy into our economy using these circular principles?
Okay, no biggie then. Thanks.
No, well, I thought I'd hit off with a big one.
How should we change the entire global economic system? Well,
I know you have your thoughts on this. So,
so I think that there are two parts on there. There's how do you do that within the structure that we've got? So one of the things that's been frustrating for those people who are working in the community business and this kind of social enterprise sector, and anyone working in looking to change models to being about commons and shared value, is that we find ourselves having to find a ways around, look for a loophole, think about a way in which you could somehow within this current prevailing system squeeze in something that still might just about work. And that's been the kind of development and the trajectory of social enterprises in particular and people in the social economy for, you know, for the last 20 or so years. And that's kind of worked, but what is revealed and what is increasingly evident and become hugely the narrative at the moment, of course, is that finding a way to work within the economic system isn't good enough. The system is broken, brittle, inequitable. And so what actually we need is a kind of wholesale change. And I think, of course, that's an easy thing to say and an almost impossible thing to do straight off. But what's also becoming clear, and as Ken really clearly pointed out, is that there's not just one economy, there's all kinds of economies going on. There are all kinds of activities, all kinds of systems happening at any one time. And so by developing and proving that there are models that can work in a different way, in places where you wouldn't imagine that would be possible, we start to really reveal that there is a different possibility for a different future. And I think that kind of demonstration that there is another way that's possible is a really core part of what we're doing. I think the other part is continuing to shout loudly about the inequity in the current system, and building an ever greater kind of common ground in making that message really clear. And even that, that increasingly cuts through. We saw only a couple of weeks ago Andy Haldane from the Bank of England talking about social infrastructure as being absolutely vital to our economic resilience. I mean, that's an extraordinary thing for someone in his position to be saying. And so I think there is this real shift in the way that things are cutting through, and a real revisiting of whether the model is appropriate. That gives some real hope that there is, a better version out there, and that people are adapting it. And I think the other thing that's really important is the point I tried to make earlier, which is that we choose our economic system. That the economic system isn't just a thing that's independent of all of the people who make it up and all of the resources in it. We choose this system, we accept it. And the system that we choose says everything about the kind of society that we want to be. So if we want to be a different one, then we choose a different one, and we make our voices heard, and we find ways to do that.
Thank you, Jess. To comment on what Jess is saying, or to think about the original question.
Sorry, was that a question aimed at me, or?
Yeah. Do you want to provide some thoughts on what Jess has said?
Yeah, there's one or two just little comments which I think they both come from other places, but I think are very important. George Monbiot, the environmental and writer and thinker, he said that the progressive left, if you want to call it that way, or the progressive end of things, and the left hasn't had a new economic idea for 70 years. He was quite serious about that. In other words, the story about the narrative about how these relationships work in the economy has to be backed by a theoretical narrative, or a narrative which has got some theoretical strength to it, not just these are some good things, but how do you do that? And Yuval Harari is my other choice, who in his various writings, Sapien, Homo Deus and whatever, he said that society progresses by sharing a sense of a positive future. It doesn't actually have to be true. It has to be inclusive enough and motivating enough for people to say, I want that. So you have to have both the ideas to enable it to happen. And I mean, going way beyond what immediate post-war sort of old-fashioned left and right sort of positioning is, that's no good going back there to find your inspiration. It's a different world now. But you need to be able to have both the aspiration and some idea about what is the different economic story you want to tell. And I think that's where I pick up with Jess, is that one of the key things to me that's occurred is a revival of this idea that there is the rentier economy and there's the productive one. Because you need to know who it is might be with you, who it is might be having undue rewards. And it had been very tangled up. It's all productive, of course, but in fact it isn't. We've got a lot of writing, say, by Ranulph Raha in New York, Makers and Takers, Michael Hudson, Steve Keen, people like that, who say there's a very real distinction between the rentier extractive economy and the productive one. So the beginnings of a story and a set of aspirations are happening, but if anybody wants it to happen straight away, nobody's really finished building that story yet, or we haven't built it all together. So that's what I would say on that. It's another criticism of the more progressive end of things by George Lakoff, the expert on framing, was progressives just want to get in and do something. They make the mistake of assuming everybody really thinks like them, and all that's got to happen is doing something. But the rest of the people don't necessarily think like them. We think it's obvious, but a lot of people don't. And on he says, in terms of the right, of the more conservative types of thinking blocks, they have think tanks, busy framing their ideology. We somehow think that's it's a bit controlling, it's not inclusive enough. Yet in that failure, Lakoff says, we don't spend enough time deciding what the narrative is and what are the tools to get there. We should need to stop assuming that everybody thinks like us.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point that both you and Jess have raised, is that the narratives are really, really crucial here. It's how we form part of our identity. You know, everything from who we are as individuals to communities to the nation. You know, we tell ourselves we believe in democracy, or we believe in this particular type of commerce or another. So engaging at that level is really where you start to see change, and that's where the important conversations need to be had. It's not about what we necessarily disagree with. It's about what we can find in common and moving forward in that way.
I would say people interested in this direction are principally interested in empathy and responsibility. For instance, there's two key elements of it. But it's actually a long story, and my main point here is to, you know, it's a bit like the people who show up at emergencies and accidents. They're told, don't just stand there, think. You know, don't just get in and do something unless you know how it fits with the bigger picture. I think that's where we are.
I can't agree more with all of that, but I think out of those two conversations, I think there's two really critical points. One of which is our economies are built on stories, and we're now starting to realize that those stories may not be completely accurate or true, and there may be other stories that have actually more providence or are more evident in the way that we operate and just the human nature. And when I was doing a talk a couple of weeks ago, Bonnie Schoppard, an architect in the Netherlands, mentioned a really interesting thing, that once we start to create new stories and have enough people believe in those stories, we will start to see the shift happen before us. And that's, I think, what Ken was alluding to there. The other thing is, I feel that it needs to be a mixture of a top-down and a bottom-up approach. If we wait and rely on the top-down, then, you know, it's going to take a long time and it may never happen. If we only take a bottom-up approach, we'll only get so far and then hit barriers. So I think if we start with both the bottom-up and the top-down, and what I mean by that is doing things like, for example, what we're doing in Watchet, where we're creating wealth and power in a community. And that starts with time, with enough, you know, facilities or industries around the world creating that similar wealth within communities, the power dynamic will start to shift. And more to add to that, when you then look at the top down and you bring along those giants and those large governments that are in charge and that are making decisions, and show them how much value there is in this and how much a lot of the work that they currently do can be done by others once it's distributed and can actually be shared. And there's a lot of evidence that this could actually be a much more resilient economy. Then it becomes a much clearer picture for them. And I feel it brings them along the journey. I think we need to understand that everyone has their own motives, their own incentives. Once we align those motives and incentives, align the offerings with the needs, then you start to have a much more holistic and cohesive economy.
Wonderful. Thank you, Ehab. We're running a bit short on time now, unfortunately, and the questions have just started to flood in response to what our panelists have been answering. What we'll do is we'll try and answer as many of the questions that we can offline through some Ferries who are working in the background to answer some of your questions. But I think we've only got time for about one more, unfortunately. And I think in the context of the virus and the government's furlough scheme, providing what many now see as a sort of a universal basic income, and they kind of see that this is possible. To what extent, and I think this is for you, Ken, to what extent could we move towards building some of that resilience into our economy?
Yeah, this is very close to my heart. I tend to call it a basic dividend. And the reason for choosing dividend is it's a reward for participating in a commonwealth, if you like. When you say basic income, it sounds like a giveaway from a government, whereas a basic dividend is what you are entitled to as a human being, as a share of the Commonwealth. But that's beside the point, but it's actually an interesting framing one. One of the basic one of the important elements of a basic dividend is it takes away insecurity. That's its aim. It's got to be at a level which it takes away insecurity, and then it prompts entrepreneurial, social enterprise activity. People don't think well when they're stressed. It's just, you know, basic psychology. They don't make great decisions. Their health deteriorates, all the other things. So it's very interesting to think that actually the rich might want to join in with this, because all businesses need customers. And the simple question is, where are you going to get your customers from if the economy is stumbling along? You know, you're not going to be able to do that. So it's in quite a number of people's interest for them to have enough income to be able to spend. And if they can also then find the opportunity and interest to help co-create wealth in their own communities, you can get this thriving sort of economy which you're looking for. So I see that as an essential part of it. It's not the only one, but how you sourced that basic dividend. I mean, Guy Standing is the expert on this, and he's got a nice little book out called Battling Eight Giants, you know, the advantages that basic dividend would bring. So I think that's part of that new economic story. It's enabling, it's supportive, it helps get resources used locally and wealth circulated. You know, this is a key part of it for me.
I completely agree. I think the idea of calling it a dividend, because semantics are so important, is a really helpful distinction between something that people might perceive as just a free giveaway and something that might be, you know, your reward for being an active member and participating in a community and a nation potentially.
And just one point, I think Steve Keen points out, and I fully agree with it, it has to be universal. So you're going to give it to the rich as well. It's not means tested. It's there for everybody. Otherwise, you just won't make it work. You'll get stuck in arguments about morals. Whereas if it's a universal basic dividend, it's a universal basic dividend, you know, get over it. It's what you do. And I think one last recommendation for me is the new book coming out by Stephanie Kelton called The Deficit Myth, which would really helps. I've seen previews of it, but it really helps you with understanding this. I think modern monetary theory, it's generally called. It's not modern, but it's a theory which helps understand how the monetary flows could be manipulated to provide the sorts of things we're talking about here.
Thank you, Ken. Ehab, Jess, is there anything you'd like to add on that point?
I think for me, I mean, I entirely agree about the framing around dividend. I think it's a really interesting suggestion. For me, the thing about universal basic income, or whichever phrase we talk about, is that it's an acknowledgement about our humanity and our creativity and the multiple of opportunities that people have and the things they believe in and they care about, and how you choose to live your life should be determined by something other than an economic system that has set you on a trajectory that you've never had anything to do with. And so for me, it's that at its core, that the current system, as I said earlier, doesn't allow us to be the kinds of people that we are. And replacing that or finding a way to do that means that people have choices and they can participate how they want rather than how they are, rather than a system in which they're forced to participate by decisions made completely outside of their sphere of influence. So it's that giving agency. And in all of our work, when you work in communities, it's always about agency. I don't want to bring in Brexit since we've all forgotten about it, but the lack of control was a kind of heartfelt, this has got nothing to do with me, and misdirected whatever, but nonetheless that feeling is intense in communities. And it's about agency, and it's about being able to make the choices for yourself within your community and your economy to do what you think is important to you. And so a system that enables that, to me, seems to be an extraordinarily powerful one.
Thank you, Jen. So there's been a lot there today. I hope the audience has taken a lot from it, and that it's not only been thought-provoking for you, but also potentially action provoking. I think we all recognise that today, as disastrous as the pandemic is for everyone, and that combined with where we are in terms of the ecological disaster we're all facing in the next few years, we can take some of the lessons and some of the thinking that we've discussed here today and move forward and apply it and challenge the situation here and globally to really sort of implement systems and processes and thinking that not only benefit us as a collective humanity, but also as individuals and communities, and really bring some of that agency and empowerment that we've been speaking to really down to the local context. I think finally, I just want to say a thank you to all of the panelists for those really, really fascinating presentations. I think we could continue this conversation long into the night, but unfortunately time is drawing to a close. If you've got any further questions from the audience, please do pose them in the Q&A, and we'll try and answer them the best we can once the webinar has concluded. But finally, I'd just like to say that from Biome, the company is really leading a revolution in industry, and we appreciate that we can't do this alone. So we'd like to invite you all to come along on the journey with us. And as previously mentioned on social media, we'll be sending a link to everyone who's participated in this webinar with an invitation to join our equity crowdfunding campaign, which we are going to be publicly launching on Monday. But by following the link, you can register and get exclusive private early access to that, and really be part of this revolution that we've all been speaking about today.
And also plug in Ken's new book, which is coming out shortly.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure speaking to all the panelists, and I hope that everybody who's been watching has been inspired to make a change in their own lives and in the communities in which they live. So I'd like to take the night to say thank you from myself as well, and hopefully we'll keep in touch and speak again soon.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.